This is episode 28 of That Shakespeare Life.
Hi, I'm Francine Segan, a food historian and James Beard Award-nominated author of Shakespeare's Kitchen. Another great method for studying the history of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
These are names that the familiars of the witches, the demons who are supposed to be possessing these young women in Buckinghamshire in the 1580s, these are the names that these demons were given by those who said that they were possessing them. And funnily enough, they turn up in King Lear as well. And they are so exact, the parallels are so exact, that it seems obvious to those who have read both that Shakespeare did indeed read this account of the Devils of Denham, this place in Buckinghamshire where the girls were exorcised.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
Halloween is coming up a few days from now, and it seems like a good opportunity to explore the origins of the holiday, which began as a religious celebration. Of course, since then, it's grown into a fun night of candy and costumes for us here in the U.S., but for William Shakespeare, ghouls, ghosts, and witches had real-life implications. While King of Scotland, James VI became convinced witchcraft was an active danger to him personally, and in order to prevent that danger, he conducted witch trials that began in 1591. James was convinced that a coven of powerful witches was conspiring to murder him through magic and that they were in league with the devil. In 1597, after the witch trials concluded, James published his study of witchcraft called Demonology. When he then became King of England in 1603, that book was published in London and became available to people like William Shakespeare. James I's fascination of witches was so well known that many historians believe that Shakespeare composed Macbeth and included the famous three witch sisters specifically for James I. To help us understand this part of Shakespeare's life and exactly what the state of witchcraft was during Shakespeare's lifetime, as well as the influence of this part of society on the plays we have from the Bard, we welcome Marion Gibson to That Shakespeare Life as our guest today. Marion is a specialist in witchcraft and magic in literature. Her research investigates the relationships between writings about magic and the supernatural. She's written several books on representations of witchcraft, magic, and the Renaissance, including Early Modern Witches, Witchcraft Cases in Contemporary Writing, and her latest book, which she just completed in 2018, is called Rediscovering Renaissance Witchcraft, a book examining the ways in which 16th and 17th century writings on witchcraft have continued to inspire modern literature. She is also the author of Shakespeare and the Elizabethan Exorcism Controversy, Reading Witchcraft, Stories of Early English Witches, and the Arden Shakespeare Dictionary of Shakespeare's Demonology, among several others. Marion, we are delighted to hear from you on this very exciting topic. Welcome to the show.
Hello, Cassidy.
We mentioned James I's well-known fear of witches, but this was not just a paranoid king bringing his fear into society. For all of William Shakespeare's life, witchcraft was illegal, with official laws being passed in 1563 by Elizabeth I, and there were a few even before that date. So explain for us, Marion, what was this kind of suspicion with witches? Was this a daily occurrence for William Shakespeare in the 16th century?
Yes, I expect it was. It was really common for people to believe that others were using witchcraft against them in the 16th century and the 17th century too. And you would get in each little village maybe a couple of witchcraft accusations per decade, say something like that. And then occasionally a big panic where a lot of people would be accused, rather like the Salem case that your listeners might know about.
Well, one of Queen Elizabeth's courtiers, Sir Walter Raleigh, once defined witches as women controlled by the devil. Was that a working definition of witches in Shakespeare's lifetime?
That's a really fair definition, yes. So most witches who were accused were women, and it was often thought that they were controlled by the devil rather than the other way around. So some people would think of witches as people who were manipulating the devil, were using his powers. But if you were a demonologist, somebody who had theorized how demons worked, you would say that actually the devil was always in control of the women who were thinking of themselves as witches. So yes, that is a fair definition.
Now, in Marion's book, Early Modern Witches, she shares a transcript of several of the witch trials conducted in the late 1500s England. And Marion, I did notice that most of the people accused were women, and I wanted to ask about this distinction. You said that they felt that the women were controlled by the devil, and yet these women were put on trial for what seemed like they were being blamed for the crimes that they were committing, but the definition of witches would suggest the person themselves were not to blame. Was there a dichotomy going on there?
Yes, there is. It's contradictory, isn't it? So they are being tried for a crime because they're thought to have harmed their neighbours, done problematic things in their community, and they're held responsible for that. But at the same time, the men in their society were quite keen to deny them any real power themselves, and therefore attributed it to the devil. So yes, the devil does the crime, but the witches are blamed for it.
No sympathy or compassion at all for their position.
Very little sympathy.
Now, when Queen Elizabeth discovered wax effigies being burned over a dung heap, she called in the magus, John Dee, to perform counter magic. Now, with this witch trials going on and opposition to the performance of magic, why was it okay for there to be John Dee at court performing counter magic, which seemed like it was a good thing instead of something bad?
It depends who you are, what you think about counter magic. Some people in Elizabethan society would have thought that that was just as bad, and that Dee was a witch and that he should be tried, the same as any village woman who was accused of witchcraft. But other people, and many courtiers were amongst those people, actually did use magic quite regularly, or they consulted those who did. So if there was something wrong in their lives, they'd sometimes go to an astrologer or a magical healer and attempt to get things fixed. And Dee was seen as one of those, really. He was an astrologer, he was a mathematician. His kind of magic was seen by some as being better than the magic that ordinary village women were using. I think it helped that he was male and that he was learned and he used books and things like that.
It seems really arbitrary in terms of knowing as a citizen how to stay on the right side of the law when it came to this.
I think that's right. So people had tremendous trouble deciding whether or not it was lawful to look for treasure by magic. No, it wasn't. But then on the other hand, you might not automatically assume that that was illegal. After all, you weren't harming anybody, were you? But it was still seen as a heretical thing, as a crime against God, and as something which should be discouraged by every means.
Now, in her book, Early Modern Witches, and I know I shouldn't just say in her book because Marion has written a lot of books on this topic, but the one that I focused on for today is Early Modern Witches, and she outlines how many of the trials for witchcraft were done, and many of them read like giant lists of accusations upon re-accusations of friends accusing friends and family members, and it seems that anyone can call out and accuse someone else to try and save themselves. And with all of this confusing back and forth of accusations, Marion, was anyone ever found innocent of being a witch?
They were, yes. It's surprising, isn't it? Because, as we've said, there was very little sympathy for witches. It's often assumed that they were all convicted and hanged or whatever it was that happened to them in the jurisdiction that they lived in. But that wasn't the case. Quite a lot of people were acquitted, and you will often find that a jury has considerable sympathy for somebody who's clearly very poor, has been going around begging from all her neighbours, and has now been accused. Sometimes people could find that indictments didn't stand up in court. So it was possible to be acquitted if you were the right person in the right circumstance at the right time. But of course, for most people, that wasn't the case, and therefore there were an awful lot of convictions.
Now, we've well established that witchcraft and dealing with witches was an everyday thing for someone like William Shakespeare, which makes it not at all surprising to find several accounts of witchcraft in his plays. But one of the most famous of Shakespeare's references to witches is that of the three witch sisters in Macbeth. And these witches were able to disappear, prophesy, and summon spirits. And Marion, I wonder if you can connect this to real life for us and share, were there documented cases cases of real people being able to do similar things to those acts, or were the witchcraft actions going on in Shakespeare's lifetime less fictional than what we see in his plays?
It depends which kind of witchcraft actions you pick on, really. So, for example, in order to be a witch, you were more or less automatically thought to have raised a spirit and to have had some sort of contact with it. You could do this in a very complex kind of way, by drawing magic circles and chanting Latin poetry and all the rest of it. But of course, most village women, and indeed the men who were accused occasionally alongside of them, didn't have access to that kind of magic. So they were assumed to have raised the devil simply by doing something wicked, by committing a sin, by swearing or calling down a curse on their neighbour or something like that. So almost all witches were thought to have raised a devil or a spirit in some kind of way. But far less common are some of the other activities that Shakespeare and other writers attribute to witches, such as flying, for example. These are things that witches on the European continent were sometimes thought to do, but it was very rare for English witches, especially in Shakespeare's time, to be accused of that kind of thing. English witches were actually a lot more grounded in every sense of the word. They were more likely to be trying to harm their neighbours' chickens than they were to fly through the air, for instance.
No flying through the air. I like that distinction. I defer to your expertise here with this question, but I think there was an association, for at least in Shakespeare's lifetime, between madness and witchcraft, and the idea that when someone was found to have a mental illness, there was sometimes the assumption, or at least a suspicion, that they were suffering at the hands of a witch. Is that correct?
There is an association. I mean, again, as with the magic of John Dee, different people in Elizabethan society would have held different views. So for some people, this would have been a straightforward medical case, although because medical science was in its infancy then, they would have had great difficulty deciding why it was that a person was mentally ill. What was it? It was their humours, it was a part of their body malfunctioning, what could it be? So some people wouldn't have accepted the definition of witchcraft, but others would. They might have thought the person was possessed by a devil, for example. If the person was speaking in voices that did not seem to be their own, or said they were hearing voices in their head, that was perhaps an indication that they might be possessed for some Elizabethans. And of course, because medical science was, again, as I say, in its infancy, it was very difficult to decide what kinds of things might be acting on different organs of the body. So maybe devils were in there poking away at the different organs and making somebody ill. And of course, that could include the brain, just the same as the other organs of the body. So yes, there was an association between magic and madness, although it wasn't absolute at all. There were other explanations too.
Well, in trying to understand Shakespeare's plays through the lens of the history and the time period that he was living in, I want to ask you about Hamlet. And in Hamlet, after he potentially spurns Ophelia by not marrying her, he comes down with a kind of madness. And traditionally, we attribute this madness to some sort of lovesick condition at not being able to marry her. But then we learn of Ophelia drowning when Gertrude specifically mentions, quote, her clothes spread wide and mermaid-like, while they bore her up. So my question for you, Marion, is whether or not there is an association to that story and the witch trials, which would use drowning and the floating versus sinking as a way of telling if a woman was or was not a witch. Is Shakespeare confirming Ophelia as a witch here, who caused Hamlet's madness when he specifically says that she floated?
That's really interesting, and I really like that as an idea. I'd kind of like to see a 2,000-word essay on it, if you wouldn't mind. I'd like to explore that further. I'm not sure he's saying that she is a witch, but I do see what you're saying about the imagery. It is very witchy, isn't it? And the fact that she's compared to a mermaid as she floats as well puts her very much in that supernatural realm. Of course, Ophelia is mad, or seems to be mad herself as well, and that's quite often one of those interesting slippages that occurs around cases of witchcraft and magic and demonic possession. Is somebody mad? Is somebody possessed? Or are they themselves a witch? Is the fact that they seem to have a demon inside them, is that an indication that they're on the dark side, if you like? So I like the idea that there's supernatural imagery floating around Ophelia as she drowns, if you like. Of course, if she drowns, she's innocent, isn't she? Or at least if she's a witch and she sinks, she's innocent. So maybe that's something to do with her innocence in the play, the way that she's continually portrayed as an innocent character, including by her brother, for example. I think it's a fascinating suggestion. You could pick away bits of those imagery, that imagery that goes on around Ophelia, to say there's a heavy supernatural influence here, if you wanted.
And we can't put it past Shakespeare to ask a question he then leaves unanswered.
Absolutely. Yes, it was one of his favourite techniques, wasn't it? Drop something into the reader's mind and see what they make of it.
Well, in 1592, another play that Shakespeare wrote was Comedy of Errors, which features the ineffective exorcist, Dr. Pinch, who blunders the diagnosis of Antipholus and Dromio of Ephesus with being possessed. And in her book, Early Modern Witches, Marion describes a story from that same year where theater influenced the actual trial of a supposed witch inside a pamphlet called The Most Wicked Work of a Wretched Witch. The contents of the pamphlet very closely matched a play which had been staged that same year by Robert Greene, who interestingly accused Shakespeare of being an upstart crow that same year as well. So this was a very busy year for Shakespeare. And Marion, please explain this story and how did theater impact the reputation and trial of witches?
This is a fascinating story that you've picked up. It's absolutely right. So in 1592, a farm worker from the county of Middlesex near London called Richard Burt seems to have made an accusation against a witch called Mother Atkins. Now, we don't know how much of this is true and how much of this is the invention of the person who's writing a pamphlet, a kind of early newspaper account about Richard and his activities. But either way, what he says is that Richard said that he'd been attacked by this witch, Mother Atkins, and that one of the things that she'd done to him was actually cause him to fly through the air. She hadn't flown herself, but funnily enough, what had happened to him was he'd been hoisted up out of the fields, out of the barn where he was working, and dragged away across the field. So he'd had this wonderful aerial view of Middlesex, but then he'd fallen down into hell. So obviously this is a very strange experience that Richard is having. And when he got down to hell, he said it was very hot there, it was very dark, it was so hot, in fact, he was thirsty. And then he remembered that he had a penny on him in his pocket. So he looked around for an alehouse to spend it in, which again is a very strange thing for somebody to say. And then after a while, he was looking around, he realised there was nothing in hell for him to do, and he said this out loud, and the devils became annoyed in some way and said, take him away, take him away. So they took him back to Middlesex, and then eventually he appears in front of the court and says, this is what the witch did to me. This is eerily similar to some of the action in, as you say, a play of the same year by Robert Greene. And in that play, there's a character called Miles, who is a comic character. And he too goes to hell, and he starts looking around for alehouses there. That sounds terribly similar, doesn't it, to what happened to Richard, theoretically happened to Richard.
Hard to be an accident. Yeah, definitely ironic, to say the least.
I think so. I think there is a similarity between them that is really hard to ignore. You don't get that kind of story in other witchcraft trials. And I think either the person who wrote the pamphlet, or possibly Richard Burt or his employer or somebody who was involved in that case, had been to see the play, and it influenced their telling of the story about this witchcraft trial.
Well, John Darrell is a famous Elizabethan clergyman who exorcised, do you say that? Exorcised? I said that right? A set of girls from demons in 1586 in Derbyshire, claiming to know 13 witches in the town in what would become known as the Elizabethan exorcism controversy, when Darrell found himself accused of faking these exorcisms. Now, Marion has written a book on Shakespeare's relationship to this controversy specifically, but before I ask you about Shakespeare, Marion, please briefly explain this event and why was it a controversy?
So in 1586, John Darrell is called in to exorcise a young woman called Catherine Wright in Derbyshire. She seems to be suffering from some kind of melancholy, and she starts having these strange fit-like symptoms. And he's called in and he decides she's possessed by demons and does indeed exorcise her. And this gets him a bit of a reputation. He's then called into other cases across the English Midlands and the north of the country. And this goes on for several years. So it's as late as 1598 that this controversy starts to come to a head, and then it spills over into the early 17th century. Some people think that he's faking the exorcisms and that the people he is exorcising are not in fact possessed. They too are fakes. This is all fake news from their point of view. Other people think he was a Puritan and believed quite earnestly in what he was doing. The whole thing becomes very controversial, and Darrell ends up in prison because of it.
Well, the Archbishop of Canterbury called for the investigation against John Darrell, and the prosecutor in the case wrote a book called A Declaration of Egregious Popist Impostures in 1603. And that book was used by Shakespeare when he wrote King Lear. Marion, can you explain what it is about King Lear that lets us know Shakespeare read this particular prosecutor's account of Darrell's prosecution, specifically the terms flibberty-gibbet and smulkin?
They're great names, aren't they? And
yes.
Again, it's about coincidence in many ways. These are names that the familiars of the witches, the demons who are supposed to be possessing these young women in Buckinghamshire in the 1580s, these are the names that these demons were given by those who said that they were possessing them. And funnily enough, they turn up in King Lear as well. And they are so exact, the parallels are so exact, that it seems obvious to those who have read both that Shakespeare did indeed read this account of the Devils of Denham, this place in Buckinghamshire where the girls were exorcised. There are other names too, Modo and Mahu, some of the other names that Edgar in King Lear gives to the devils with which he says he's possessed. It seems too close a coincidence to be anything other than Shakespeare had read this.
Well, with all of these details and coincidences that seem too hard to be accidents, when we look at Shakespeare and the Comedy of Errors, it's certainly within the right time frame to be referencing Darrell in the play. And I wanted to know, do you think Dr. Pinch was intended to be a character type of John Darrell?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do. I think that this had become very topical at the time. A lot of people knew this news story about John Darrell. And I think Shakespeare's playing with that idea. So yeah, I do. I think Pinch is Darrell in some respect.
Well, we have covered an immense swath of territory in today's talk, but there's so much more to explore when it comes to Shakespeare and witches, including several of Marion's excellent books, which we will definitely link to in the show notes, and you do not want to miss those when studying this topic. But Marion, I am curious what your favorite sources were when you were compiling these books. In addition to your books, where do you recommend people go to learn more on this topic?
I'd recommend people read the original Witchcraft pamphlets, the ones that are in early modern witches. You can get them online in many places now. Obviously, it's some years since I wrote that book. They are fantastic. They are the stories of ordinary English people in terrible trouble of one kind or another. And they're absolutely fascinating, both in their magical detail and things they tell you about the lives of ordinary English people in that period. I'd recommend Diane Purkis's book, The Witch in History, as well, which is a book from the 1990 count of many of the plays. And if you want to know more about the Devils of Denham and the relationship between the John Darrell case and the Devils of Denham case and King Lear, I'd recommend that people look at Shakespeare, Horsenet and the Devils of Denham by F.W. Brownlow. That's another very good book which deals with the relationship between King Lear and actual cases of demonic possession.
We ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that is, what is your absolute favorite book of all time? The 1 to 2 titles that you would take with you on a deserted island if you could only take 1 to 2.
Well, I'm going to cheat slightly here because in the British version of Desert Island Discs, which is a radio show here, you always get to take the works of Shakespeare with you. So I take the complete works.
Do you? Okay.
It's really good, that, isn't it?
Yes.
You get to take out religious works, you pick the Bible, the Quran, or whatever, and then you get to pick up top of that the complete works of Shakespeare. Yay! On top of that, though, I would take George Eliot's novel Middlemarch, which I have always liked very much indeed, and I would take Jane Austen's Emma too. I think that's another wonderful book for its precision of construction and its wonderful story of the heroine Emma and her misfortunes.
Well, thank you very much for those recommendations. What's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
I am working on witchcraft pamphlets again after a break of many years when I've been working on other things. I'm working on one from the 1580s where I found some new evidence. I know more about the lives of the people who gave evidence against the witches, and I know more about the witches themselves now. So I think there's some new things to say about witchcraft pamphlets in the next couple of years.
Well, that all sounds very exciting, and we appreciate so much you being here. Marion Gibson, Professor of Renaissance and Magical Literatures. We are so glad to have talked with you today.
It's been a pleasure, Cassidy. Thanks for asking me.
Marion Gibson has written multiple books on this topic of witchcraft and Shakespeare and early modern England and society, all of which are listed for you in today's show notes, along with a gift from me. It's a Halloween-themed Shakespeare quote from Macbeth, as you might expect, that we mentioned in today's episode. For all of these great things, please visit today's show notes at CassidyCash.com/episode 28. That's CassidyCash.com/EP28. Would you like to meet me in England? In September 2019, I'm taking a group over with British History Tours to walk through the life of William Shakespeare. We'll be spending a couple of days in Stratford-upon-Avon, and then we'll travel over to London to see the Globe, where we'll have a private behind-the-scenes tour there, and we're hoping to get to see a play. And I want you to go with us. It would be amazing to get to meet you at all, but certainly to get to meet you in William Shakespeare's hometown would be amazing. Please consider traveling with us and get your early bird tickets while they last. There's still a few of them left, but we are only giving early bird tickets to the first 8 people who sign up. But you can still grab some of those and get all of the details about the trip at CassidyCash.com/travel Shakespeare. That's it for this week here at That Shakespeare Life. Until next time, I'm Cassidy Cash, that Shakespeare girl, and I hope your week is a Shakespeare-filled week.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.